Venice, 1499. A 14-year-old girl named Cecilia wakes up to screaming. Ottoman raiders are kicking down doors along the Adriatic coast. By sunrise, Cecilia is chained in the hull of a ship heading to Istanbul. She doesn't speak Turkish. She doesn't know where she's going. She only knows that the last thing she saw was her mother's body lying in the street. 3 weeks later, Cecilia stands naked in a marble bathhouse while strange women examine every inch of her body. They check her teeth like she's a horse. They measure her height. They inspect her skin for blemishes. She passes inspection. Within a year, Cecilia will become Hürrem Sultan, the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. She'll bear the Sultan's children. She'll influence state policy. She'll live in unimaginable luxury. But here's what no one tells you, she'll never leave the palace again. She'll never see another man who isn't a eunuch or the Sultan. She'll never write a letter without it being read. She'll never make a choice without permission. And if she steps out of line even once, she'll be sewn into a weighted sack and drowned in the Bosphorus. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the true story of what happened to European girls stolen into the Ottoman harem. I'm Stripped History, and today we're uncovering the reality behind the silk curtains, the reality that Ottoman propaganda spent 500 years hiding. If you want the truth about history that empires tried to erase, subscribe to this channel. Because what comes next will destroy every romantic myth you've ever heard about harem life. Hit that like button, because this story needs to be told. First, let's destroy the biggest lie, the idea that girls chose to enter the harem, that it was an honor, that families volunteered their daughters. That's propaganda. Here's the truth. Between 1400 and 1700, the Ottoman Empire systematically kidnapped approximately 500,000 to 1 million girls from Christian territories across Europe and the Caucasus. 500,000 to 1 million. Let that number sink in. These weren't volunteers. These were victims of a practice called the Devshirme, the child tax, where Ottoman officials would travel through conquered Christian territories and forcibly take children. For boys, this meant becoming janissaries, elite slave soldiers. For girls, especially beautiful ones, this meant the harem. The selection process was brutal and methodical. Ottoman scouts would identify the most beautiful girls in each village, typically between ages 12 and 16. They looked for specific features, light skin, symmetrical faces, tall stature, no physical defects. Girls who met these criteria were taken. No exceptions. No negotiations. If parents resisted, they were killed. If girls ran away, their entire families were executed as punishment. Some families, knowing the scouts were coming, would deliberately scar their daughters' faces, cutting their cheeks, burning their skin, anything to make them ugly enough to be passed over. Think about that. Parents disfiguring their own children to save them from this fate. The girls who were taken were chained together in groups of 20 to 30 and marched hundreds of miles to Istanbul. Many died during the journey from exhaustion, disease, or abuse. Those who survived the march faced something worse, the inspection. When girls arrived in Istanbul, they were taken to the Imperial Harem inside Topkapi Palace. But before they could enter the harem proper, they had to pass a test that would determine whether they lived in relative comfort or spent their entire lives as invisible servants. The test was simple: be beautiful enough. The girls were stripped completely naked and taken to the palace baths. Here, elderly women called Kaya would examine them for hours. Every physical feature was evaluated. Skin tone and texture. Facial symmetry. Teeth alignment. Body proportions. Hair quality and color. Breast size and shape. Whether they were virgins. This wasn't a medical examination. This was livestock inspection. The girls who passed, maybe 1 in 10, would be trained as potential consorts for the Sultan. The girls who failed became servants. They'd spend the next 20 to 40 years cleaning, cooking, and serving the women who had passed inspection. But even passing inspection didn't guarantee safety. It just meant you'd moved from one nightmare to a different one. Let me tell you what happened to a girl named Sofia. Sofia was captured from a village near Belgrade in 1520 when she was 13 years old. According to Ottoman palace records preserved in the Topkapi archives, Sofia was selected for harem training. For the next 5 years, she underwent brutal education. She was forced to learn Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. If she spoke her native Serbian, she was beaten. She was forced to convert to Islam. If she refused to pray 5 times daily, she was denied food. She learned Ottoman court etiquette, music, dance, calligraphy, and poetry. These weren't hobbies. These were survival skills. Because the Ottoman harem wasn't a pleasure palace. It was a competition, a deadly, ruthless competition where hundreds of women fought for the attention of one man, knowing that winning meant power and losing meant invisibility or death. By the time Sofia was 18, she had been in the palace for 5 years. 5 years of training, competing, surviving. And she still hadn't seen the Sultan. Not once. Most girls never did. Of the approximately 2,000 women living in the Imperial Harem at any given time during the 16th and 17th centuries, maybe 50 would ever spend the night with the Sultan. The rest? They were just there. Background decoration in someone else's story. But let's talk about what happened to the girls who did catch the Sultan's attention, because this is where the story gets even darker. If a girl was summoned to the Sultan's chambers, she had no choice. This wasn't a date. This wasn't courtship. This was rape, by any modern legal definition. She couldn't refuse. She couldn't negotiate. She was brought to his bed, used, and then either kept or discarded based entirely on his whim. If the Sultan liked her, she might be summoned again. If he didn't, she'd return to the harem and never see him again, spending the next 30 years watching other women get the chances she'd lost. But here's the truly horrific part: if a girl became pregnant, her life became exponentially more dangerous. Because in the Ottoman harem, pregnancy wasn't a blessing. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. Let me explain the politics. The Ottoman Empire didn't have clear succession laws. When a sultan died, all his sons would fight for the throne. The winner would become the next sultan. The loser, and all his supporters, would be executed. This meant that every woman who bore the sultan a son became a player in a deadly game. If her son became sultan, she'd become the most powerful woman in the empire, the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother. If her son lost the succession fight, she'd be strangled with a silk cord and buried in an unmarked grave. So women in the harem didn't just compete for the sultan's attention. They competed to produce male heirs. And then they spent the rest of their lives plotting to ensure their son survived. This led to systematic poisoning, arranged accidents, and outright assassinations within the harem. Women would poison rival women's food. They'd pay eunuchs to smother competing women's infant sons. They'd arrange for accidents, a slip on wet marble, a drowning in the bath, a sudden fever that no physician could cure. The Ottoman archives document dozens of cases where concubines died under suspicious circumstances, always ruled as accidents or natural causes, but the pattern is unmistakable. Let me tell you about Mahidevran Sultan, one of the most tragic figures in harem history. Mahidevran was a Circassian girl, captured around 1500 when she was approximately 13 years old. She caught Sultan Suleiman's attention and bore him a son named Mustafa. For years, Mahidevran was the most powerful woman in the harem. Her son was the eldest prince and presumed heir. Then the Sultan met Hürrem, the Venetian girl we talked about at the beginning. Hürrem was younger, more beautiful, more clever. She seduced the Sultan completely. She bore him 4 sons. And then she did something unprecedented. She convinced the Sultan to execute his own son Mustafa, Mahidevran's child, claiming he was plotting rebellion. In 1553, Sultan Suleiman ordered his own son strangled to death by deaf-mute executioners. Mustafa was 38 years old. Mahidevran, who had spent 53 years in the harem, who had borne the Sultan's first son, who had survived decades of harem politics, lost everything in a single day. She was exiled from the palace and lived the remaining 28 years of her life in poverty and obscurity, forbidden from ever returning to Istanbul. She died in 1581 at age 94, having spent 81 years, more than 8 decades, as a prisoner of the Ottoman system. Now let me tell you about the punishment system, because this is where the true horror of harem life becomes undeniable. The harem had elaborate rules governing every aspect of women's lives. And the punishments for breaking these rules were designed to be both brutal and invisible. If a concubine was caught speaking to a man who wasn't the sultan or a eunuch, 40 lashes with a whip. If she attempted to send a letter outside the palace, beaten and demoted to the lowest servant rank. If she was caught in a sexual relationship with anyone other than the sultan, death by drowning. This last punishment deserves explanation, because it reveals the calculated cruelty of the system. When a woman in the harem was sentenced to death, she wasn't beheaded or hanged publicly. That would be too obvious, too scandalous. Instead, she was taken at night to a private chamber. She was sewn into a weighted sack, still alive, fully conscious. The sack was then rowed out to the middle of the Bosphorus Strait and thrown overboard. She would sink immediately, drowning in complete darkness, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to be saved. The Ottoman archives mention this punishment in carefully euphemistic language, removed from the register, or sent to the sea. European ambassadors who lived in Istanbul during the 16th and 17th centuries documented these executions. The Venetian ambassador Ottaviano Bon wrote in 1608 that he personally witnessed sacks being thrown into the Bosphorus at night. He estimated that during his 4-year posting in Istanbul, he saw evidence of at least 12 such executions. 12 women, drowned in sacks, in just 4 years. And those were only the ones he happened to witness. The real number is almost certainly much higher. But let's talk about the psychological torture that didn't require physical punishment. Because the worst part of harem life wasn't the threat of execution. It was the absolute erasure of identity. When a girl entered the harem, she was given a new name. A Turkish name. Her Christian name was forbidden. Cecilia became Hürrem. Sophia became Safi. Maria became Mahidevran. Their birth names were erased from all records. It was as if the girls they had been simply ceased to exist. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages. European girls who spoke Italian, Serbian, Greek, or Hungarian to each other were severely punished. Within 5 years, most girls had forgotten their native tongues entirely. The language of their mothers, their childhood, their identity, gone. They were forbidden from practicing Christianity. The palace had no churches. If a girl was caught praying in the Christian manner, she was beaten until she stopped. They were forbidden from writing letters to their families. Even if a girl somehow learned that her mother was still alive, she could never contact her. They were forbidden from leaving the palace. Ever. For any reason. Think about what this means. A girl captured at age 13 might live to age 70. That's 57 years, more than half a century, spent inside the same palace walls. Never feeling rain on her face without permission. Never walking through a forest. Never swimming in the sea. Never attending a wedding, a festival, a funeral. Never making a friend who wasn't also a prisoner. Never loving someone who chose to love her back. The Ottoman poet Baki, who had access to the palace, wrote a poem in the 1560s describing the harem women as caged songbirds who forgot their songs. That's exactly what the system was designed to do: take vibrant young girls full of life and dreams and slowly, systematically erase everything that made them individuals until all that remained were interchangeable ornaments in someone else's palace. Let me tell you about one more girl, because her story reveals something that Ottoman propaganda never mentions: what happened to women when the Sultan died. Her name was Turhan Sultan. She was captured from Russia when she was 12 years old in 1627. She caught Sultan Ibrahim's attention and bore him a son, Mehmed, in 1642. In 1648, Sultan Ibrahim was deposed and executed. His 6-year-old son Mehmed became Sultan. Turhan, at age 33, became Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. For 35 years, she effectively ruled the Ottoman Empire while her son reigned as a figurehead. She accumulated unimaginable wealth. She commissioned massive architectural projects. She wielded power that most European queens could only dream of. But here's what the history books don't tell you. When Turhan died in 1683 at age 68, she had spent 56 years, more than 5 decades, as a prisoner in the Ottoman system. Despite being the most powerful woman in the empire, she never left Istanbul. She never returned to Russia, never learned what happened to her family, never spoke her native language again. When she died, her wealth, her palaces, her political influence, all of it vanished immediately. Ottoman law stated that everything a concubine owned belonged to the Sultan. When she died, he inherited everything. She spent 56 years accumulating power, and the moment she stopped breathing, it was as if she had never existed. This was the fate of the most successful woman in the harem system. The one who won the game. Now imagine what happened to the thousands of women who didn't win. By the 18th century, some European girls who'd been captured managed to escape and return home. Their testimonies reveal details that Ottoman records deliberately omit. One such testimony comes from a Romanian girl named Elena, captured in 1710 at age 15, that she spent 8 years in the harem before escaping during a period of political chaos. She eventually made it back to Romania, and in 1725, she gave testimony to Orthodox Church officials. Her account, preserved in the Romanian church archives, is one of the most detailed first-hand descriptions of harem life we have. Elena describes the complete surveillance. We were watched every moment. Eunuchs stood at every door that we could not speak to each other without being overheard. Even in sleep we were watched. Privacy was a concept that no longer existed. She describes the psychological manipulation. They told us we were fortunate. They told us girls outside the palace lived in poverty while we lived in luxury. They made us believe that captivity was privilege, that slavery was honor. She describes the competition. We learned to see every other girl as an enemy. Your friend today might poison your food tomorrow if she thought it would increase her chances with the Sultan. Trust was suicide, and most hauntingly she describes what happened to women's minds. Some girls went mad. They would scream at walls, talk to people who weren't there. The eunuchs would take them away, that we never saw them again. We learned not to ask questions. Elena's testimony corroborates what Ottoman archives hint at but never state explicitly. The harem had a section called the Forgotten Chambers, where women who lost their sanity were kept in isolation until they died. These women were never officially recorded as dying from madness. The records would list natural causes or illness. But palace servants who worked in those chambers told different stories. Stories of women who had been locked away for decades, women who no longer remembered their names, women who rocked back and forth humming lullabies to children they'd never had. So why don't we hear about this? Why is the Ottoman harem romanticized in movies, portrayed as exotic and luxurious, when the reality was systematic enslavement and psychological torture? The answer is propaganda, both historical and modern. During the Ottoman Empire, the government maintained strict control over how the harem was described. Foreign ambassadors were never allowed inside. The few Europeans who wrote about it were relying on rumors and propaganda. Western Orientalist painters in the 1800s, artists who never set foot in a harem, created fantastical paintings of lounging beauties in silk, eating grapes, living in sensual paradise. These paintings sold for fortunes in Europe. They fed Western fantasies about the exotic East. But they had nothing to do with reality. The women in those paintings look happy, relaxed, free to move about. The real women were prisoners who could be killed at any moment for any reason. The women in the paintings were flimsy, revealing clothes. The real women wore heavily layered robes and were punished severely if they showed skin to anyone but the Sultan. The women in the paintings recline on cushions, looking bored and content. The real women lived in constant fear, competing desperately for survival. And even today, Turkish tourism promotes the harem as a cultural heritage site, describing it as the private quarters where the Sultan's family lived. That's like calling Auschwitz the facility where workers were housed. It's technically true, but it deliberately erases the horror. The Turkish government, which inherited the Ottoman legacy, has spent the last century whitewashing this history. They focus on the small number of women who became powerful, Hürrem, Kozum, Turhan, while ignoring the thousands who died invisible, forgotten, and broken. The last sultan to maintain a harem was Abdülmecid II, who was deposed in 1924. When the Turkish Republic abolished the Ottoman monarchy, they freed the remaining women in the Imperial Harem, approximately 400 of them. Most were elderly. Some had been in the palace for 50, 60, even 70 years. They emerged into a world that had changed completely while they'd been locked away. The empire had fallen. The caliphate had ended. Modern Turkey was rising. These women had nowhere to go. Their families were long dead. They spoke languages that were outdated. They had no money, no skills applicable to the modern world. The Turkish government gave them small pensions and settled them in state-run housing. Most died within a few years. The last survivor of the Imperial Harem died in 1952. Her name was Ali Melek Hanım. She was 94 years old. She had entered the harem as a child in 1876. She spent 76 years as a prisoner. When journalists asked her about her life, she refused to speak about the harem. She would only say, "There are some stories the dead should keep. But we're not dead. And we can't let these stories die." The Ottoman harem wasn't a fairy tale. It was industrialized human trafficking that destroyed hundreds of thousands of girls' lives over 400 years. This is stripped history. We don't romanticize the past. We don't let propaganda erase the truth. And we don't forget the girls who never made it home. If you want more stories about the dark side of history that empires tried to bury, subscribe to this channel. Tell me in the comments, what other historical, romantic, myths need to be exposed for what they really were. Because Cecilia, Sophia, Elena, and hundreds of thousands of girls like them deserve better than to be remembered as exotic footnotes in someone else's empire. They were victims.